I want to talk today and share with you why I switched over from a more traditional audit universe approach to one where I focused on a risk universe. So as you may know, my background is in England. I come from England, where I became a chartered accountant with the firm of Cooper Brothers, which became Coopers & Lybrand and now PwC, and then moved into IT audit, and then came to the States where I was a senior manager in charge of the LA office for Coopers & Lybrand for a while before I moved into internal audit, into IT management, and then back as the head of internal audit for a number of companies over something like a 20-year period. So I remember when I took over as the head of internal audit, I was used to this rather traditional approach within audit universe. And I remember reading a book by an individual who lived near me, David McNamee, talking about the risk-based approach and the audit universe. And the idea was that you made a list of all of your auditable entities, which were your business units, your locations, your major processes, your lines of business, and so on. And then you use some number of attributes, maybe as many as a dozen or more different attributes, to risk rank those auditable entities. And the attributes could be the time since last audit, complexity, size, revenue change, the level of change in the management team, and so on. And then you would devise an audit scope for the higher rated entities in the audit universe. Well, that's all well and good, but it didn't seem to quite work for me. And it was just brought home when, as the head of internal audit for Tosco, I intended maybe about 6 months or a year into my tenure, which is over 10 years at this great company, Tosco Corporation. And I attended this audit committee meeting, and one of the people there was the CEO, Tom O'Malley. Now, Tom O'Malley, frankly, is one of the most brilliant people that I've had the privilege of knowing and working for. He had been a principal trader at Bear Stearns, if I remember correctly, and had actually made more money trading than the chairman of the firm. So he was absolutely brilliant, and he took his money and invested it in the company together with some friends. And so he was not only the CEO, but he was the principal shareholder and essentially the owner of the company. And as I was going through and explaining to the audit committee my audit plan and how I had done a risk assessment, which actually used the COSO internal control framework, looking at where the risks were as it relates to financial reporting, compliance, operations, and so on. He asked me, Norman, have you considered blending? Blending. Now, let me explain a little bit. Tosco Corporation was an oil company, oil refining company. At that time, it had one refinery up in Northern California, and that made products like gasoline and diesel and jet fuel and other byproducts, which are sold wholesale. At that time, we didn't have gas stations. After some years, we had a lot of gas stations. But at that time, we just had the one refinery and selling wholesale about $2 billion a year. So blending was not something that I had considered and looked into. So I told Tom that I would look into it. It wasn't on the audit plan. Nobody had brought it to my attention within management when I talked to them. So I looked into it and talked to a great gentleman, Dwight Wiggins, who was one of the top executives in the refining business. He became the head of the refining business for Tosco. And he was a former executive with Exxon. And he told me when I asked him, he said, yes, blending had been identified, especially the blending of jet fuel, as the most significant risk for the whole of ExxonMobil. That's pretty astounding when you think about it, because here's this massive organization, ExxonMobil, which had major disasters, such as the tanker that discharged a ton of product into the ocean. There was also a discharge from a pipeline under the New York harbor, which caused a lot of distress. And both of those resulted in huge reputation damage and financial loss. But they had identified jet fuel blending as the #1 risk to the organization. Why? Well, as Dwight explained to me, it's fairly obvious. If the jet fuel is incorrectly blended and doesn't function properly, it may only kick in and cause damage to one or more jet engines on, say, an airliner as it's flying over a major city, causing it to crash, potentially significant loss of life and damage. Significant enough loss to cause the whole of ExxonMobil to fail. So they had identified blending as the #1 risk. So I took that back and I looked at how blending controls that ensured that our products were properly blended to meet quality specifications at the company. And I found out that this was, in fact, quite a significant area. And so I did the audit myself because I wanted to understand the business better. And I found that, yes, they blended different streams of products to make gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and other products. And they needed to do that very carefully and very precisely in order to meet the quality specifications. How did we ensure that was done properly? Well, they would test a sample. They would take a sample of every batch of produced product, every batch of product. They would take a sample before it was sent down the pipeline to where it was going to be sold. That sample would then be tested in the lab, and it was confirmed, hopefully, not otherwise, but it was confirmed that it met the specifications. And all of that had to be done clearly before the product went down the pipeline. So there are all kinds of issues about taking the sample, taking all the samples that were necessary, sending them over to the lab, and the lab then having the equipment and the personnel to evaluate the quality of the batch promptly. And I found some issues. There were some issues regarding the maintenance of the equipment used by the lab. There were some issues in terms of the timely processing of the testing. And so this was a fruitful audit. And it turned out some years later that the company had potentially some issues in our diesel that was sold in the Los Angeles area, in LA, in that the quality was not quite right. And so what you had was something called dieseling in cars, where it would ping and the car wouldn't quite run right. And then they had to go in and get some repairs done to the vehicle and so on. That was a few years later, but he just identified that, yes, this was in fact a potential issue. But why did it make me stop? It made me stop talking about an audit universe because you're not going to find this kind of issue. That's something buried fairly deep in the operations that could be a risk to the success of the organization and the achievement of its objectives, just by looking at business auditable entities. Instead, we should look at where are the risks? Where are the risks to the achievement of objectives? Where are the risks to the success of the organization? In the same way as management and the board are looking for a risk assessment, and you have a chief risk officer. So we should be looking at a list of risks, not a list of auditable entities. And then we should be devising audits to assess the controls and the management of those risks, not only as to whether those risks are being properly addressed, managed, and mitigated, but in some cases whether there are enough risk being taken. So I changed to a risk universe and strongly suggest that everybody should discharge as obsolete the whole concept of an audit universe. We should be aligning with the chief risk officer and his or her team. We should be aligning with the way in which management and the board think about risk. And we should be moving to a risk-based approach with a risk universe. And a risk universe is simply a list of risks to the achievement of objectives. And those may be positive, they may be negative. So, for example, a positive risk that should be assessed is whether the sales team is being properly organized and structured in order to optimize revenue and optimize customer satisfaction and relationships. It's somewhat the obverse of a negative risk, but it's still looking for are we optimizing the opportunities, the ability to increase the likelihood of success of the objectives of the company. So I strongly suggest everybody moving to that approach. It is far more effective. You're not going to miss as many major issues, but it does require really getting in and understanding the business. You can't just look at an organization chart or a company structure chart and build an audit plan based on that. You have to really understand the business and what could go wrong, but also what needs to go right, and what are the potential things that could be done better, and then assess the controls over that. So that's why I strongly support the movement to risk-based, enterprise risk-based auditing, rather than the traditional approach based upon an audit universe. I hope that that's useful to you, and I encourage you please to subscribe to the audit channel, the Norman Marks on YouTube channel, and I expect to be recording more of these over time. Thank you.